Most of our calls are pretty run-of-the-mill things, like wasp nests in attics or raccoons living in the walls. That being said, Orion is considered a specialty pest control provider due to the services we offer for atypical or unrecognized pests. Those terms may seem vague at the moment, but I promise they'll make more sense in a second. A general rule of thumb, if you think that you are dealing with an unidentified animal, is that salt repels most things. Not everything, but most things. Ground up white eggshells can be used as well if you're environmentally conscious. I try to use them when I can, but salt is more readily available. Administering a line of salt to doors and windows, especially windows facing the west, is normally the first course of action we recommend to clients who are concerned about potential infestations from unknown sorts of critters. However, if you believe that there is an infestation already taking place, it is also possible to use the salt to contain the pest until someone is able to remove it. With that being said, sometimes more aggressive actions is necessary when dealing with an atypical pest. On that note, here's a little PSA from your friendly neighborhood pest control specialist. Avoid coming into contact with any deer, raw venison, or serving fecal material for a while. I know that most people don't feel inclined to play with deer crap to begin with, but Yents would be amazed at the insane things I've seen grown adults do. And unfortunately, many of those insane things were indeed scat related. Anyways, we received a call from a client claiming that her dog was attacked by a doe, of all things. Typically, we don't have to deal with deer since they tend to avoid humans, normally. That's the Department of Wildlife area of authority, but something was clearly off about this one. Initially, I was thinking that it had chronic wasting disease, since one of the symptoms noted in the affected animals is that they no longer become skittish around humans. The client was understandably frantic on the phone. It just came up and bit my dog, and now it's in my yard. It won't leave. I swear, it's waiting for us to come back out. CWD is essentially deer Alzheimer's. So attacks from affected deer are typically brought about by confusion on the poor, dying animal's part. That prompted me to ask the client about how the deer looked. If it was emaciated, that would be a dead giveaway. She said his stomach was bulging, like it was pregnant. It was apparently watching her and her frightened doggie through the window, drooling. The distended stomach gave me pause. That wasn't usual for CWD. Thankfully, it was a slow day, so I was able to get over there as soon as possible. Before I left, I called one of the guys from the Department of Wildlife, knowing that they want to hear about it, especially if there was some sort of deer disease that could be going around. The officer said that he and his partner would take a look, but they were going to arrive a bit after me. No problem there. When possible, we live trap the pests that we are called out for. That being said, some of these unidentified animals can be extremely dangerous. This is why a firearm, a container of salt, and a knife with a silver blade are required to be on us at every call, even if it appears to be something harmless. Appearances can be deceiving. My boss learned that the hard way once. As such, the salt and knife stay on my tool belt at all times. We do also have a tranquilizer gun for large animals, which I thought would be useful for the deer. When I first got there, I didn't see the doe, so I circled around to the backyard, trank gun at the ready. An expensive looking swing set shaped like a castle stood like a colorful fortress, the chains squeaking as they swayed in the wind. A few yards away, the deer snorted at me, its hull stomping at the ground. The animal's fur was disheveled. His ears were drawn back close to his head. Foamy strings of drool hung from the corners of his mouth. The white patch of fur on his neck slick with excessive salivation. Whether it was CWD or something else, the deer was definitely sick. Best not to go near it. So I shot it with the trank gun. It let out a small grunt of alarm, taking a few ungainly steps towards me. I stepped back, trying to keep my distance until the animal could be knocked out. It shuddered, mouth open like it was about to vomit at first. I thought the pink thing in his mouth was the doe's tongue, but then more appeared. Long tendrils unfurled from his throat, stretching along the grass towards me. A loud crack echoing in my ears as the deer's jaw snapped. The deer's body convulsed violently, its bloated stomach rapidly shrinking as these abhorrent things slithered out of his mouth. My stomach lurched at the sight. I let out an extremely professional-sounding whimper as I booked it for the swing set. Something you should know about me is that I have a phobia of worms. Snakes, spiders, rats, no problem. But for some reason, worms make my skin crawl. The deer had fallen to the ground, the poor animal still alive and quaking as his body was dragged by the worms, crawling out of his throat across the lawn, inching towards me. A low, pained noise came from the deer each time it was jerked along. Once I pulled myself into the swing set tower, I took aim at the deer's head with my rifle and fired. Blood and gray matter splashed across the yard. The worms twitched, thrashing around like jump ropes, wielded by particularly aggressive of toddlers. I shrank back, grimacing, becoming slightly nauseous when I looked a little too closely at where they protruded at what was left of the deer's open mouth. I fired again. The worms jolted from the impact, their thrashes becoming more lethargic as their hosts died. The ropey bodies slowed their convulsing down to mere twitches until they eventually were limp on the ground, fanned out in separate directions along the grass. I watched the worms warily, not convinced that they weren't going to suddenly start rising again. Gingerly, I reached for the salt, wondered if I should go down and pour it on the worms, make sure that they were actually dead. All I had to do was go down there, where they were. Worms, roughly the length and width of human intestines. Worms that appeared to have taken over the body of a deer. Fuck me. With a deep breath, I reluctantly slid down the slide to get down from the tower. With how tall I am, I scooted only a tiny bit before the soles of my boots touched the ground. My jaw clenched in anticipation. I got to my feet quickly as one of the worms weakly squirmed, trying fruitlessly to get nearer to me. I was close enough to see that it had a round, jawless mouth edged by rows upon rows of small, sharp teeth. Ugh. Resisting the urge to flinch away, I lifted the lid for the salt, then dumped it on the horrible creature. It began its thrashing anew, and I jumped back, preparing to run back into the swing set like the big hero that I am. But, thankfully, the worm seemed to be in his death throes. After his last bout of writhing, his movements finally ceased. Oh, thank God. I repeated this process with the other ones until they were all immobile, and by the time I was done, I was shaky, trying to regain my composure. I promise I'm not this squeamish about most of the things we deal with. It's just worms that get to me, and even then, I still get it done. I waited until the wildlife guy showed up to knock on the client's door. Truthfully, my hands were still shaking a bit since my adrenaline was wearing off, so I kept them in my pockets. I didn't want her to get even more freaked out than what she already was, especially with the news I was about to give her. I informed her that the deer's body was being taken by the Department of Wildlife to run tests, advising her to take her dog to the vet to check on any signs that worms may have infected it. Her face paled. Worms? Unfortunately, yes, I replied, resisting a shudder as I recalled the rows of teeth against my will. I don't know how these species of parasites spread, so just be safe, have your dog checked. The Department of Wildlife is going to take over from here. They'll be able to give you more information once they've examined the deer a bit more. Before I left, I discovered that the wildlife guys were just as disturbed by the worms as I was. One officer said that he'd never seen anything like it. They planned to take the doe's body for testing and said that they'd let both the client and me know if they found anything out. Later that evening, I received a call from the Department of Wildlife. They wanted to know exactly what I did to kill the worms. I told them. Growing concerned, the client's dog was being quarantined after the vet found strange readings in his blood work. This made my blood chill. The client and her family were also being advised to visit a doctor in case any of them also came in contact with any infected biological material. The wildlife officer advised me to do the same. They weren't sure if the worms could infect humans, but since it had potentially crossed the species barrier by infecting our client's labradoodle, they recommended extreme caution. I don't think I came into contact with the worms, but I know better than just mess around with things like this. Even though my doctor assured me in my initial assessment that everything seemed normal, I was convinced that any minor twinge in my body was a worm squirming around in my guts while I waited for my test results. In the end, everything came back normal. Good. I don't think I'm emotionally or psychologically equipped to deal with massive worms growing inside of me. Unfortunately, the dog wasn't so lucky. It's not dead, don't worry. It just had to deal with numerous anti-helminth medications until the vets found one that was effective. Thankfully, it's alive and back to its inviolable life as a spoiled labradoodle. Though I guess the poor thing is more skittish than it used to be. Can't say I blame it. It was good to know this parasite is treatable as long as it's caught early enough. Granted, it isn't clear how long that window is open for, hours, days, weeks. According to the officer I spoke to, it was difficult to tell how long the doe was infected for. Meanwhile, the dog had only been bitten a few hours prior to needing aggressive anti-worm treatment. They must spread and grow pretty fast. That gives me the impression that the treatment window must be pretty small. When I mentioned atypical organisms earlier, things like those worms were what I meant. They're merely animals that hadn't been identified yet. We get a lot of those around here, not parasitic worms, thank God. I'd need a career change if that were the case. I mean, odd critters in general. Not all of them are hostile, either like any animal. Most of the time, it all depends on how you treat them. Take the housekeepers, for example. While I was still waiting to get my blood test from the worm incident, I had a call from a client that started with, "Hey, I called the police, but they told me to talk to you for some reason. Someone has been breaking into my house and cleaning it. They haven't taken anything, which is weird. I don't know what some rat catchers would know about that." I rolled my eyes. We don't have any shortage of uppity suburban prigs like this who think their silly little office jobs make them superior to everyone else. Some rat catchers. Despite my irritation when I spoke, I was professional. Have you or anyone else experienced any sensations like being pinched in the middle of the night? What kind of question is... He started to snap, but I guess his brain must have turned on because his tone suddenly changed. Actually, yes. What does that have to do with the thing in my house? I ignored his question. Have you found any broken glassware? Yes. How did you know that? Sounds like you have what we call a housekeeper. They tend to get a little feisty if their work isn't appreciated. So if you leave out some cream before you go to bed at night, the problems should be stopped. The client adopted his snippy attitude again. Is that supposed to be a joke? No, sir. I'm completely serious. If you leave the housekeeper the offering like I told you, it'll continue to clean your house without causing any more issues for you and your family. Can I speak to someone who actually knows what they're talking about? I was struggling to think of a reply that wasn't riddled with curse words when a pale hand appeared in my face. When did the boss get in? And why do you look so awful? Was he sick? The boss flatly said, He wants to speak to the manager, doesn't he? Without another word, I handed him the phone. As the boss politely ripped the client a new one, I scanned him. He was always a pale guy to begin with, being Scandinavian, but he was even more pasty than usual. The permanent dark circles under his eyes even more pronounced. Another thing that stood out was that he had a bandana tied around his neck, an odd fashion choice for him. His arm was covered by the navy blue company jacket we all wore, so I couldn't check for what I truly needed to see. The client ended up hanging up on the boss. He shook his head, grumbling as he set the phone back in the cradle. Be prepared for this asshole to call back in a few days. I followed him into his office. Victor, is everything alright? The boss didn't look at me and said, I'm as great as I usually am. That wasn't a good answer. I was about to press the issue when he muttered, I'm not using it again. Don't worry about it, alright? Reluctantly, I nodded, then went back to my desk. I've known Victor for years. He opened up when he was ready. Sure enough, the dickhead didn't end up calling back 3 days later. Would you know it? He didn't follow our advice. Now, the housekeeper was angry and somehow that it was our fault. Customer service, everybody. I dragged out our new hire, Renia, along for this one to give her some experience. This was the first time seeing what happens when housekeepers are mistreated. I just prayed that it hadn't transformed. In case it hadn't, I took a container of fresh cream, hoping that a late offering would be enough to calm it. The client and his wife were cowering in a hotel, leaving the house entirely to us by giving us permission to use their hidden spare key. When we got inside, the place was wrecked. Broken glass littered the carpet and kitchen tiles. Cabinets were left wide open, empty during the housekeeper's tirade. The white couch looked as though it had been clawed. Family photos were ripped up on the floor. I told Raina to keep her container of salt handy, wide-eyed, head swiveling, to take in the state of the house. She obliged. It hasn't followed the family, which hopefully means that it hasn't transformed yet, I informed her. So, what does that mean? She asked. That means it can still be reasoned with. I found a bowl that hadn't been smashed and poured the cream into it. I loudly announced that I had a gift for the housekeeper. Transformed housekeepers will still accept cream. They'll just try to pull your ears off afterwards. Anxiously, I waited to see what would come out. The floor above me creaked. Raina noticeably stiffened, looking at me for guidance, trying to emulate my body language. One thing I can pride myself on is that I'm decent at pretending to be more calm than I actually am in circumstances like this. Worm incident aside, the footsteps descended the stairs, revealing the client's agitated house guest. The bipedal humanoid creature couldn't have been much taller than 2 feet. Neatly combed, coarse brown hair covered his wrinkled body. Its brow was furrowed in a scowl, his lips curled in distaste as it showed off crooked small teeth. Where it would have made sense for a nose to be was only a bony hole in his face. In summary, it hadn't transformed yet. Thank God. Disgruntled, the housekeeper stomped over to the bowl of cream, clutched it with both hands, and downed it in 2 gulps. The entire time, Raina watched with wide-eyed fascination. Once it was done, the housekeeper glared down at the table. It grumbled, "You got any Baileys, girl?" "I do not," I replied ruefully. "Shame. You'd be needing Baileys too if you had to deal with these fucking people." Not wanting it to get angrier, I poured it some more cream. This time, it sipped gently at its offering, seeming to settle down some. When dealing with the housekeeper, it is important to always be polite. As such, I courteously asked the housekeeper if it could be excused for a brief moment to talk to Raina. he gruffly agreed. I whispered to her, "Stop staring at him. He'll consider that rude." Instantly, Raina looked away from him. I continued, "If you have to speak with the housekeeper, make sure you act like you're dealing with royalty. No smart mouthing, and no matter what, do not smile or laugh in his presence. Don't tell it your name, and don't ask for his. Understood?" She furrowed her brow at me, but didn't question me as she did what she was told, coming over to join us at the kitchen table. When I rejoined the housekeeper, I said mildly, "Your hosts have been ungracious." The housekeeper snorted. "No need to sugarcoat it, girl. Fucking little mannered snot nose layabout jack-offs is what I'd reckon they are." I nodded. He wasn't wrong. Rinya, following my lead, did the same. "All I ask for is a damn bowl of cream at the end of a long day's work. But these people wouldn't know a good day's work if it bit them on their arse. This is the fucking waste of air, I reckon." It carried on, ranting and raving like that between sips of cream. Silently, I let it, making sure to keep my eye contact brief enough to avoid staring, but long enough that the housekeeper would know that I was properly paying attention to our one-sided conversation. The housekeeper's vocal rampaging continued. They couldn't even be bothered to get rid of themselves. They sent 2 little girls to go on and do it for them. Maybe I'll stay, just to spite. Break some more of that precious china. Keeping my tone gentle, the same voice I use for young children and argumentative clients, I try to de-escalate things. But you're such a dedicated worker. Your talents are wasted on people like this. You deserve to be recognized for your efforts. The housekeeper sipped his cream thoughtfully. You speak truths, girl. Truths they are. I waited patiently for him to finish his bowl of cream. Raina's eyes and mouth were tight with anxiety as the room quieted, with the exception of the housekeeper gulping down his drink. Finally, he set the bowl down and declared, I'll be seeking elsewhere. I'll seek worthy. Internally, I breathed a sigh of relief. We wouldn't have to deal with a transformed housekeeper today. The 2 idiots that pissed it off won't go missing, not like others, who we couldn't get into in time. The client may be a prick, but I don't wish that upon him. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Before we left, I had Raina help me line all of the house's entryways with salt. While I doubted the housekeeper will come back, I didn't want to leave it to chance. So, do you think our client was grateful? Take a guess. For whatever reason, the idiot thought we cleaned his house for him after we got rid of the housekeeper. He and Victor got into it over the phone, and the client threatened to sue for something. Fucker. Shouldn't just let the housekeeper destroy the place. I chose these 2 cases for a few reasons. This first one being that I want everyone to be aware of the deer parasites. Please be careful out there. The second reason is that Orion operates in only a few counties in Pennsylvania and Ohio. While we can't help everyone, we can at least arm you all with the knowledge so that Yents don't get in a bad situation with an unidentified animal. Just remember, when in doubt, salt. And if you awaken to find that your house is now suddenly spotless, be gracious. Do better than the idiot mentioned above.